G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at the race week preview ahead of the Saudi Arabia Grand Prix this coming weekend and my final thoughts as we prepare for the visit to Jeddah. If you're enjoying the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'm really appreciative of all of the love and support so far. So I've got a couple of thoughts on the screen here that I want to dive into a little bit more ahead of practice and qualifying kicking off on Friday, Saturday. First on my list is Charles Leclerc. As many of you know, he, due to the engine stall failure he had last race week in Bahrain, may be subject to a potential grid penalty. We've heard nothing as yet from Ferrari or the FIA as to what that will consist of, if anything at all, and we should hear more about it closer to practice on the Friday. However, because of that, it makes him a very favourable candidate for one of the top scoring drivers this coming race week. And because of the way scoring has been weighted to drivers that, say, qualify poorly or start further back on the grid and make up points through overtakes and positions gained, this makes Leclerc a very favourable option if he starts anywhere from, say, 14th, 15th, all the way back to 20th. I would expect he qualifies in or around the top 5, so realistically, if he takes a 10-place grid penalty, he'll start at, say, 15th. That projects his point scoring to be close to around 37 points, according to f1fantasytools.com. Do check them out if you haven't already. And as a result of that, outside of Verstappen, is the highest scoring driver projected for race week 2. So as a result, that makes him a very viable option. He's still owned by quite a number of people in the game, so I do expect him to have significant upside in this race. He also battled in a very close contest with Verstappen last year, so I expect him to be in and around that mix if he can really get as much out of the car as possible, and Ferrari don't have the same reliability issues that just seems to plague them a lot at the moment. So assuming you do want to roll with him, I'm personally still on the fence, and realistically I'm leaning towards Perez, which I'll get into in a moment. But if you do decide to angle for Leclerc, Perez will likely be one of the scapegoats, if I could call it that, to make way for Leclerc. Perez is priced at around 18 million, I believe. Leclerc a little more dear at 21.2. So obviously if you're trying to move Perez on for Leclerc, that will also mean you need to scale down one of your other mid-price drivers. In that case, it's probably going to be a Stroll, a Bottas, a Gasly, and Ocon. One of those, just because of the price difference between those two premium assets. And if you're obviously compromising on your mid-price drivers, it'll probably be a budget guy in the form of a De Vries or a Hulkenberg or a Joe or a Sargent. We'll get into that as well in a moment. So you really have to weigh up whether you like Perez and Stroll, Perez, Bottas, or you like a Leclerc and a budget guy. I'll direct you to F1 Fantasy Tools just now. I want to walk you through kind of the points projections they factored in for this race week. If we look here on the screen, we've got Leclerc coming in at 21.1 million, projected to score around 36, 37 points this race week. You got Perez a little further down, around 28.5. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is if we're bringing in Leclerc for Perez, 8 points higher for this race week, you're obviously having to compromise on one of your mid-price drivers. For argument's sake, let's say you've got Perez and Stroll. Perez projects 28.5, Stroll 10.5. So that comes out at around 39 points for the race week. If, say, you want to go for Leclerc and, let's say, De Vries, for instance, he comes in at 2.8 points for this race week, that'll be 2.8, 36.8, that is 39.6. Let's say 39 for argument's sake versus Perez and Stroll for, another 39. So 39.5 plays 39, it's really negligible. And for me, the reason why I'm leaning towards Perez is just because of that reliability that we see in the Red Bull and then the Aston Martin as well. We saw a lot of that last season. Stroll was very reliable through the middle stages of the season, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to take a gamble on Leclerc. I know those overtakes are, there for the taking, and that has a lot of points upside, but to me, I just don't think this early in the season I'm willing to take a risk on him yet. Not to mention that Verstappen is also going to be my DRS booster. So unless you really think Leclerc has a very valid case for your DRS booster over Verstappen, I can't really see myself trading for him if he's just going to serve the same role as Perez, and Perez will never be my DRS booster if Verstappen's in the team. So for an extra 3 million and a projected points of maybe 1 or 2, it's not something I'm really leaning towards at the moment. But again, if we see things in practice that suggests that for whatever reason Perez is so far off the pace and Leclerc's looking good, not so much that he qualifies P1 or P2, but that top 5 and he takes a 10-place grid penalty, then perhaps I will reconsider. But right now I'm still sticking to my guns with triple Red Bull, triple Aston Martin, and a budget driver. So let's get into that in a minute, but do stay tuned for the Ferrari news and whether or not Leclerc does decide to move ahead with taking that grid penalty. So next on my list are the budget drivers. I've touched on it already in my watch list videos. Do check them out if you haven't already for race week 2. Joe is probably the one I have the most lack of surety about heading into this race week. Obviously had a very first strong race to the season, had that fastest lap, banked him that 10 points, finished with 15. So obviously cannot complain whatsoever with that kind of output from someone at 4.9 million. But as I've touched on and as we observed last week, there are a lot of drivers a little bit further down the grid that managed to make up significant ground through overtakes and positions gained as a result of DNFs and strategy errors from other drivers ahead of them. So De Vries and Sargent are 2 that I've already taken a look at previously. I think they both look really good for overtakes and positions gained. And for me personally, considering they are probably going to qualify quite far back, De Vries was P19 if it wasn't for Gasly's deleted track time, P20, and Sargent, he was P16, I believe. So both right inside Q1, and Piastri, I believe, who was there? Piastri, why don't we take a look? But Piastri was one of the other names that made up the mix qualifying times, I believe I hear. So yeah, Piastri, he came in at 18th, K-Mag 17th, and then obviously Sargent 16th and Nick in 19th. So I expect over time this may not happen in the second race of the season, but I think as Piastri gets to grips with a McLaren, which I think comparatively is still over the course of a season going to be stronger than the AlphaTauri and the Williams, I expect to see him move up the qualifying position slightly. Magnussen, we saw, he's very capable of qualifying P1 as we saw last season. I'm not saying that's going to happen again or anytime soon, but he's also a driver with a lot of experience, and I think that was probably a bit of a red herring coming in at P17. So, and Gasly as well, we saw he put in a phenomenal performance in Bahrain. So I doubt, many of these drivers around De Vries and Sargent will be back down there again this coming weekend. So if everything goes to plan, and particularly for a circuit like Saudi Arabia, where rookies have struggled a little bit in the past, or inexperienced drivers have struggled in the past, De Vries and Sargent may well have their work cut out for them. So I think if they do end up qualifying towards the back, they'll be in a good place to make up those positions gained and those overtakes throughout the course of the race. That said, however, I do like the idea of Joe still. He's very much a good option, and I think if you're short on trades, he's probably going to qualify in that Q2 slot. So he's certainly a hold if you want to, but I think De Vries and Sargent have that overtaking upside that Joe doesn't quite have, being in a slightly stronger car. So they'll probably be one of the 2 I switch Joe out for this coming weekend. And also to keep in mind, in relation to the trades, we have 2 every week, and you're able to roll 1 for future weeks. So if you choose not to use 2, you'll have 1 next week, and 1 will just die if you don't carry or if you don't use it this week. So I'll definitely want to use 1 and then roll that extra transfer forward for Australia to give me a bit more flexibility in the weeks to come. The other thing I want to look at is the no negative chip. I've touched on that in tweets in the last week or so, and because of Saudi Arabia, it is a track that has a high DNF rate across the board. It's only been on the circuit for 2 years, so still a race and a circuit that's very much in its infancy. But we've observed in the last 2 years, drivers really struggle with a number of those faster winding corners and those narrower straights, which doesn't really allow for as much overtaking at times as we do see at other circuits. So that speed you're seeing down, I think, at Sector 1. Let's get the map up here for a second. We've got qualifying times here, Jeddah. So, we start in Sector 1. There's, it's very much pretty much a straight shot the whole way down and the whole way back up. Not as many turns, or at least sharper turns, as you see on other circuits. So I do expect, certainly for the more inexperienced drivers, they will perhaps struggle a little bit with this speed, and particularly in these DRS zones. We've seen a number of occasions in the past where drivers have had racing incidents, and 5 DNFs is certainly nothing to kind of ignore. So I think, honestly, the no negative chip, I definitely think warrants some consideration. I'm probably 50-50 right now as to whether or not I use it, but it is one of the circuits that does have an extremely high DNF rate. Last year there were a number of mechanical failures, but it was the year before where we did see quite a number of collisions and racing incidents from race restarts. Schumacher, for instance, he struggled in both years, and then we've also seen drivers like Latifi. I believe there was also Mazepin, and then Russell, when he was at Williams, also really struggled, just because that inexperience kind of puts them at a disadvantage to unlike some of their other compatriots. So I've got my eye on a number of those rookies, De Vries, Sargent. If they do qualify towards the back, hopefully that means they keep their distance a little bit from the carnage perhaps that eventuates up ahead. And I've mentioned this before, if Leclerc does for whatever reason start around 15th, he's going to be really around a lot of drivers jostling for position from the outset. So that could put his race in jeopardy if he is taken out or is collided with by someone else close by on those tighter straights and on the corners. But anyway, that's just, I think, something that we should think about. And as I say with every race, do pay close attention to practice times and the performance of those cars, because that's a lot more information that we'll have that we just don't have at our fingertips right now. So there are a few of, I guess, my initial thoughts on the race week. I just also wanted to take a quick look at my team for the race ahead. And given the state of the template, I think it's something that warrants a little bit of a discussion right now. So I've got here my team, what I guess I had from Bahrain. As I mentioned, I'm probably going to continue with the triple Red Bull, triple Aston Martin combination. I know that obviously carries risk with DNFs. If a driver goes down, that affects their score as well as the constructor score. But I also think that given the upside and the performance, especially for that Aston Martin, it's a risk I'm very much willing to take. And as I said, historically, that's been, both cars for that matter, have been very reliable in terms of performance. So I definitely hope and expect that will continue heading into this week and beyond. So Joe is probably the driver most likely to make way for me. 4.9 million. I only have 0.5 in the bank. So as I said, there's not really a lot of flexibility to choose from. Not too many options in that price bracket. So I will, if I can sort out my cursor, let's start with the value. Probably easier that way. I guess there are some names I've already touched on. De Vries, as I mentioned, I really like him and Sargent, both fairly low owned. De Vries was actually quite higher owned, I believe, before Bahrain. 19%, still somewhat of a differential given the small pool of drivers available to choose from. So for me, he would slot quite nicely into that slot there. The other one for me is going to be Sargent. Again, on definitely the cheapest side, the cheapest asset in the game. I don't think Hulkenberg for me is someone I'm jumping at immediately, just because of his qualifying performance we saw in Bahrain, and that's not taking anything away from the caliber of driver that he is. But I do worry that if he does qualify, was it P9, P10, if we look at the qualifying times here, yeah, P10. So I just worry that, as was the case last weekend, if he qualifies in such a high position, he's likely to lose spots to some of the faster outfits further back. So just something to keep in mind there. I'll likely, as I say, lean towards one of Logan Sargent and Nick DeFries, but I'll make a decision on that closer to qualifying once we've seen the practice times. And ultimately, as I've said before, it feels a bit weird rooting for a driver to do poorly in qualifying, but I guess that's the name of the game when it comes to these budget drivers in our team. So anyway, that's all from me today. As I said, if there's any other drivers you're weighing up, be sure to drop a comment below. There'll be no doubt a lot more information that comes to light as we approach Friday's practice. But in the meantime, again, thank you very much for watching. If you're liking what you're seeing, do subscribe to the channel. Really appreciating all of the support from you guys so far. And do also stay tuned to my Twitter account. My weekly race preview thread comes out around Thursday, Friday, every race week. So check that out. There'll be a lot more information there. But again, thank you very, very much for watching, and I'll see you all very, very soon.